Across the West, power has been delegated from the level of national government to various actors over the last decades. These actors all have a number of things in common. First, their democratic legitimacy is zero or close to zero. Second, they make sure that globalist values always prevail over national sovereignty, that power is always centralized, not decentralized, and that government intervention in people's lives always increases, never decreases. And third, these actors themselves accelerate the circumvention of national democracy by taking away even more power from the nation states in process. I will talk about a number of these actors here, the EU, the courts, and the United Nations. And I will mention ways in which we as national conservatives should counter this development. First of all, the EU. The EU was established to accelerate economic cooperation between the sovereign states of Europe. Now, veto rights in most areas have been abolished, and the unelected Commission has the right of legislative initiative. At this moment, the EU is also eager to take away the last veto powers on foreign policy and security and defense policy. These are the last competences which prevent the EU from acting as a fully fledged superpower internationally. We should do everything to prevent this from happening. Let's remember, the EU model is based on a one-size-fits-all approach, which in reality leads to one-size-fits-none policy. But even if this veto stays in place, the EU is still threatening to steamroll our democracies and our economies. The Green Deal is revolutionary in all the wrong ways. It's causing centralization and social engineering on a massive scale. I'm extremely worried that our prosperity and our way of life, which are unique in all of history, will not survive this. Another institution to which power has been delegated is the Judiciary. We have to talk about the primacy of the European Union law. The fact that EU law supersedes national law already shows us what the state of affairs is. Of course, deep economic cooperation within the single market requires that member states have similar legislation in this regard. However, the obvious solution for this would be to require member states to incorporate this into their national law upon entering the single market, but not to set up a completely new system that overrides national law. Another aspect here is that several countries allow procedures in the name of the common good. In practice, this enables oligarchs like Soros to bankroll NGOs that start procedure after procedure against the state, but also against ordinary farmers. This possibility to start a judicial procedure in the name of the common good should absolutely be abolished. But there is more. International treaties form a legal trap. Governments can sign international agreements without prior approval from the national parliaments. These agreements are not codified in national law. However, when some climate NGO sues the government over not abiding by some of the targets set out in this international agreement, courts will judge in favor of this NGO. Sometimes the explanation is extremely far-fetched. For example, the Human Rights Convention includes the duty to protect life. This meant you have the right not to be killed by your government. But courts now say this means governments are obliged to reduce carbon emissions. Yes, this is judicial activism, but there is a more fundamental point here. Globalist interest groups use international treaties to circumvent our democratic process. Now I will talk about the third actor engaging to circumvent our democracy, the United Nations. When the internet came up, people suddenly had access to all sorts of information. This was no longer filtered by government or oligarch-owned media. The elites lost control over the people. Therefore, they had to invent something new. In 2015, they implemented the UN Agenda 2030. Practically, this meant the birth of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. All of these goals have one thing in common. They sound so good. This will supposedly create an ideal world. But when I was young, my mother always told me, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. A valuable lesson that has been proven true here as well. The Sustainable Development Goals do not benefit all countries, all people, or all segments of society. Rather, they are supranational, they are anti-democratic, and they are top-down. Unelected bureaucrats working at the UN cannot be held accountable by voters, but do have power. Meanwhile, the UN itself is being lobbied by powerful NGOs, which in turn are funded by so-called philanthropists with big financial interest. Often these philanthropists also own large media outlets. Big business and big government go hand in hand. I will give you some examples of SDGs and their implementation in practice. One of the SDGs is zero hunger. It's beautiful, but we already managed to eliminate worldwide food shortages. The only problem is the distribution of food. There is no shortage, thanks to the brilliant invention of fertilizers. One problem, fertilizers do not fit into the climate agenda. Another example is SDG quality education, which does not mean children will learn mathematics and physics, but rather they have to learn gender ideology and critical race theory. The way I see it is as follows. The globalist socialist agenda is wrapped up inside the Sustainable Development Goals. All the new laws implemented because of these SDGs create bureaucracy and destroy small and medium-sized businesses. The result, big business takes over. We always see big business and big government go hand in hand. The former gets the money, the latter, the power. Now I come to my conclusions. I've discussed 3 technocratic threats to our democracy: the EU, supranational agreements, and the UN. Now, what should we, as national conservatives, do about it? First, we should recognize it for what it is: a global attempt to centralize policymaking at the expense of our sovereignty, our nation states, and our way of life. Second, we should propose alternatives and stick to those while in power. For the EU, a great idea was raised 2 years ago. It's not often that I praise French President Macron, but a broken clock is always right twice a day, and miracles sometimes do happen. Last year, Macron came up with a good idea: the European political community. My suggestion: turn this into a European Union of multiple directions. Let us all have a high degree of economic cooperation, but let countries decide for themselves on what issues they wish to cooperate further. A European Union à la carte. Yes to economic cooperation and voluntary partnerships, but no to a superstate. Let the European Commission become a secretariat, the European Parliament an inter-parliamentary body consisting of representatives from the national parliaments, and let the Council have the lead, all on an intergovernmental basis with full veto powers restored. For the courts, agree on economic legislation that should be incorporated by every member state to remain part of the single market, but restore the supremacy of national law and let parliaments have the last word. And for the UN, reject this Agenda 2030 embrace our traditional way of life, empower schools to educate in the way we have done it over the last century, with focus on science, humanities, and the arts, not on gender ideology, and certainly not on this anti-Western cult of guilt. Embrace new energy technologies, but do not discard our trusted energy sources before we have better new ones. Act not from the idea that we should completely change our society, but act from the idea that our ancestors have handed over to us something very precious and special, which we should cherish and cannot afford to damage. I believe this is the way forward, and I believe that if we act like this, our best days are still ahead of us. Thank you very much.